Welcome to some very famous people you've never really heard of. Bite-sized biographies of the famous, the infamous, and the quirky in less than an hour. My name is Philip D. Gibbons, and there is more information about me, this podcast, and a bibliography at someveryfamouspeople.com. There are also photographs of many of the individuals and items mentioned in this podcast. At the conclusion of Part 2 of this presentation, there will be additional suggestions concerning further information about today's subject, Laurence Olivier and Vivien Leigh. Now let's continue with our story about Laurence Olivier and Vivien Leigh. It was at this time that Olivier and Leigh embarked on a passion project that resulted from an attempt to cash in on their newfound celebrity. Encouraged by George Cukor, they decided that a theatrical presentation of Romeo and Juliet, directed by Olivier himself, would be a can't-miss draw for the public, eager to see the actor especially at his Shakespearean best. Wanting to be able to keep the anticipated profits, Olivier and Leigh sunk their own money into the project. Previewing in San Francisco, the production was dull and poorly received. Another preview in Chicago in a cavernous music hall that held 3,500 people was a flop as well. Only ego propelled the production to New York. A more prudent, objective investor would have not tossed more good money after bad. Again, eager to generate a huge profit, a 1,600-seat auditorium was renamed the 51st Theater, and performances commenced on May 9th, 1940. Because of its heavy promotion and public interest, the production was a high-profile event and immediately received a barrage of criticism, perceived correctly as a lazy and poorly conceived attempt to capitalize on celebrity. For days, long lines descended on the box office, not to buy tickets, but to return seats previously purchased with great anticipation. This failure, which closed after 36 performances, wiped out Olivier and Leigh's savings, close to $100,000 $1940. Broke, the couple once again turned to Hollywood to replenish their collective bank accounts. Deciding to combine wartime spirit with romance, Alexander Korda thought the time was right to retell the story of the scandalous affair between Lord Nelson and Lady Emma Hamilton, when Nelson was involved in stopping another European tyrant, Napoleon Bonaparte, from invading England. But before they got to work, as their 6-month waiting period had expired, the couple journeyed to Montecito's San Isidro Ranch in late August to officially marry. The couple was made aware that Santa Barbara only required 3 days to issue a marriage license, and wishing to avoid a Los Angeles media spectacle, the couple wed at the San Isidro Ranch shortly after midnight on August 31st, the ceremony performed by a local judge and witnessed by Garson Kanin and Katharine Hepburn. The couple then sailed on Ronald Colman's yacht to Catalina. So well kept was the secret marriage that Olivier actually became irritated when it was barely even mentioned in the media. The couple then started in on what was known in Britain as Lady Hamilton, and in the U.S. as That Hamilton Woman. Although quickly filmed on the cheap in 5 weeks, both Olivier and Leigh were happy to reunite with Korda, and the production was free of the strife and drama of other Hollywood efforts. The film well received on both sides of the Atlantic. Olivier's rendition of Nelson's death, a heart-tugging depiction that made the movie Winston Churchill's favorite wartime film. It was also the last film that Leigh and Olivier would ever make together. With no further film prospects, and again intent on getting back to Britain, the newlyweds took a ship to Lisbon and a plane to Bristol, England, eventually returning to their Chelsea cottage. The London they returned to was in the midst of the Blitz and a wartime regimen that couldn't be more different than Hollywood. Leigh's daughter was with her maternal grandmother Gertrude in Vancouver. Jill Esmond was in the U.S. with her infant son. Stung by criticism that he was a shirker sitting out the war in the U.S., Olivier was desperate for a military commission of any kind, which he eventually received, but devoid of any real danger. Stationed at an air station on the southern coastline, 60 miles from London, Vivien soon joined him in a rented cottage, the couple living an ordinary life for the first time in many years. With Olivier practically twiddling his thumbs, and based on the former enthusiasm for Lady Hamilton, the British government encouraged Olivier to direct another patriotic project, Henry V. With David O. Selznick trying to get Leigh to fulfill her contract, she begged off with the "there's a war on" excuse and headed off to North Africa to entertain the troops that were stationed there. Olivier filmed much of Henry V in neutral Ireland and then returned to Denham Studios on the outskirts of London. Upon her return, Vivien moved into the house rented while Olivier wrapped up Henry V. Having spent an exhausting 5 years beginning with her participation in Gone with the Wind, Vivien had lost even more weight while in Africa and was less than 100 pounds upon her return, practically skeletal on her 5-foot 3-inch frame. Heavy smoking also contributed to her less than healthy demeanor. With the invasion of Normandy and the war all but won, Olivier was allowed to resign his commission. Along with Ralph Richardson and producer John Burrell, he agreed to head the Old Vic Repertory Company, intent on producing the finest theatrical presentations possible. Some of the finest actors in Britain were included in this company, but Vivien was not asked to participate. Although she understood that she was physically not up to the demands of such productions, she still was upset by the situation. Perhaps this explained her willingness to get involved with the film version of the George Bernard Shaw play Caesar and Cleopatra, despite Olivier's advice to pass. The producer, Gabriel Pascal, was a mini Selznick who, even during wartime, insisted that sand used on his sets be transported from Egypt. His palace interiors consisted of faux granite columns weighing tons, hawks and large cats made of marble, and thousands of extras. An egomaniac, classical actors like John Gielgud wanted nothing to do with him, and few top-line talent actors got involved, Caesar ultimately played by Claude Rains. Within weeks of the commencement of filming, he fired the director and took over himself. In the midst of all of the confusion, Vivien discovered that she was pregnant, but almost as quickly as she received this revelation, she fell during filming and suffered a miscarriage, a development that sent her into a deep depression. Upon her return to work after a short hospitalization, Leigh suffered a mental breakdown, except this was both in public and during filming. During a banquet scene, she began berating a crew member over a minor wardrobe detail, and when Pascal called for a break, she exploded in an hysterical fit, screaming obscenities. That day's shoot was canceled, and she was sent home. Olivier not all that concerned when he heard of the incident, chalking it up to Leigh being upset about losing her child. He, meanwhile, was engrossed in the lead-up to the release of Henry V. Unrecognized at the time, Leigh was suffering symptoms of classic bipolarity. During this time period, even obvious mental illness generally was ignored or not diagnosed, the actress's behavior attributed to either a bad temper or eccentricity, especially in the artistic community. The fact that Vivien Leigh's aberrant behavior frequently resulted while she consumed alcohol led observers to believe that this was the actual root cause of her extreme behavior. Leigh eventually finished the film, but it was received poorly by critics and lost a great deal of money, no doubt the result of Pascal's spendthrift production excesses. Rather than confronting his wife's dysfunction and career stagnation, Olivier buried himself in his own work. Henry V was completed and released in November of 1944, a Technicolor epic that was the first Shakespearean film that found a large popular audience. In the U.S., the movie was lauded by critics, Henry V honored as one of the most outstanding motion pictures of 1946. Olivier's contract required that he did not make another motion picture for 18 months so as not to distract from the picture's release. Instead, Olivier focused on another pet stage project, Shakespeare's Richard III with the Old Vic Repertory Company. After a spectacular run in which his portrayal was hailed as the best of his career and also the finest rendition of the lead role in the history of the play, Olivier and company took the play on the road through various cities of Europe throughout the summer of 1945 as a kind of victory tour and entertainment for the members of the military still stationed overseas. He returned to Britain so cocky that he sunk he and his wife's savings into a decaying 12th century stone monastery near Oxford known as Notley Abbey, an impulsive purchase that became a terrible money pit. Nevertheless, the Oliviers threw parties that did not get underway until late in the evening, after their guests had attended theatrical events in London, attendees partying, eating, and drinking until dawn. Vivien Leigh attempted to get back on track by appearing on stage in a Thornton Wilder play, The Skin of Our Teeth, but first she had to evade the legal machinations of David O. Selznick. Selznick received $50,000 to sign off on Leigh participating in Caesar and Cleopatra, but upon hearing of her intent to appear in the Wilder play, he sought legal relief. He not only lost in the British courts, which essentially ruled that granting an injunction that prevented Leigh's employment would impose an undue economic hardship, he and all of the other major Hollywood studios were about to suffer a much bigger loss when a California court invalidated their standard contracts binding an employee for more than 7 years, coincidentally in adjudicating a lawsuit brought by fellow Gone with the Wind actress Olivia de Havilland. Unfortunately for Vivien Leigh, her successful participation in The Skin of Our Teeth was cut short when she was diagnosed with tuberculosis. Even in the mid-40s, there was no real pharmaceutical cure for this debilitating disease, perhaps an explanation for Leigh's exhaustion and weight loss. How long and where she contracted such an affliction would not be determined. The only cure available rests in a Scotland sanitarium. Eventually returning to Notley, she attempted to revise her role in the play in September of 1946, a short-lived attempt which again resulted in her withdrawal from the production. Besides exhaustion, she was also battling intense depression, followed by bouts of manic hysteria. Throughout this difficult period, the Oliviers continued their star-studded social life, guests ranging from Rex Harrison to Orson Welles to any number of other high-profile personalities and celebrities making their way out to the weekend, all-night Notley soirees. Vivien Leigh gamely tried to work again in 1947 on Anna Karenina, a former 1935 star vehicle for Greta Garbo. Despite the presence of Ralph Richardson, the film was poorly received and a box office failure. At the same time, Laurence Olivier was involved in directing and starring in a film version of Hamlet. His wife was interested in playing Ophelia, but Olivier helped cast 18-year-old Gene Simmons instead, a more appropriate choice age-wise. Leigh might also have been age-appropriate for the role of Gertrude, but Olivier again cast a younger actress, Eileen Hurley, 27 years old at the time. These developments seem to indicate a change in the state of the Olivier marriage. In similar previous situations, Olivier would have at least attempted to leverage Vivien into the cast, but in this case he played a deciding role in the selection of other performers. Although officially there to provide feedback and advice, Vivien Leigh, perhaps out of insecurity, attended filming on a frequent basis, not wanting the famous Olivier wandering eye to manifest itself. Knighted by George VI during the completion of Hamlet, the film would generate Olivier's first and only Academy Award. Perhaps thinking that a change of scenery might do both of them some good, in 1948, with partial funding by the British government, the Oliviers embarked on an official tour of Australia, a month at sea, before landing at Perth and traveling and performing in Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney, and even Hobart, Tasmania. The entire country initially thrilled by their presence. But as the tour dragged on and the entire troupe's energy sagged, this thrill dissipated, and the Australian press, among the nastiest in the world, sniping at the performances, such a high bar set for such illustrious performers. Behind closed doors, Laurence and Vivien also were not getting along, the arguments so savage that anyone nearby could readily hear them fighting. In the midst of the tour, Olivier was informed that the board of directors of the Old Vic Theatre had decided to replace him and the other two artistic directors, Richardson and Burrell, the explanation that their outside projects were too much of a distraction. The irony was that the whole Australian tour was a vehicle to raise money for the Old Vic Theatre itself. The demands of the tour finally physically got to Vivien Leigh. On a flight to New Zealand, she had a seizure which required oxygen administered through a face mask. Landing in Auckland, she was hospitalized but quickly discharged. Olivier himself was having morphine injections to help dull the pain from a ruptured knee cartilage injured while leaping during a performance of Richard III. After the final performance in Wellington, he had his leg surgically repaired. The Oliviers literally limped out of the country, so angry with each other that they were barely speaking. Later, Laurence Olivier commented that it was during this time period that he realized his marriage was doomed. Amidst this increasing marital dysfunction, negotiations began for what evolved into one of the most high-profile performances of Vivien Leigh's professional career. But this evolution would not occur without typical entertainment industry machinations. In December of 1947, Tennessee Williams' play, A Streetcar Named Desire, was first performed on Broadway. This groundbreaking work dealt with such issues as homosexuality, class, delusion, violence, and mental illness that was groundbreaking and shocking for the time period. The play transformed Marlon Brando into a star and won Williams a Pulitzer Prize. Produced by, of all people, Irene Mayer Selznick, who had separated from her husband and embarked on her own career as a theatrical producer, there was immediate discussion of a British-based production of the play. Although initially wary of the Oliviers, based on her husband David's previous experience, Irene Selznick eventually agreed to allow Laurence Olivier to direct the play and cast Vivien in the critical role of Blanche Dubois. Although her performance was mostly lauded and the play was a success, it also seemed to have negatively influenced Leigh's mental state as she began blatantly attempting to seduce other men, perhaps as a response to her own husband's philandering, which had now returned with impunity. The obvious next step for Streetcar was a Hollywood film adaptation, but the studios were nowhere near the cutting-edge iconoclasm of American theater. Such a play was still considered taboo for a mass popular audience. Based on the family connection, Louis B. Mayer was actually interested, but he no longer had the unlimited authority of past decades, and his boss, Nick Schenk, was not interested, thus also eliminating Irene Selznick from any involvement. A similar situation unfolded at 20th Century Fox with Daryl Zanuck, who was overruled by his corporate boss, Spiro Skouras, who considered the play lurid. Finally, Warner Brothers signed on. Brando was part of the package of actors attached, and Elia Kazan, who had directed the Broadway version, was also involved. Still undecided was who would play Blanche. Jessica Tandy played the role in New York, but she and Brando didn't get along. Olivia de Havilland was mentioned, but she was tied up in other projects and demanded an excessive fee, leaving Vivien Leigh, who was enthusiastic about such a high-profile casting. She agreed to a contract. Laurence Olivier would remain in Britain, directing and starring in his own play, Venus Observed. Initially, Leigh clashed with Kazan, eager to duplicate her performance as directed in London by her husband. Although diplomatic, Kazan made it clear that she was not in London, that her husband was not the director, and she needed to follow his direction. Additionally, many of the other actors were members of the cast from the New York production, including Carl Malden, Kim Hunter, and many secondary actors, making Vivien a literal outsider. Brando also was a potential nightmare, already a star and already notoriously difficult. Instead, the two seemed to feed off of each other, eliciting performances that critics agreed were far more powerful than either of the two stage performances. Kazan and the rest of the cast were ultimately won over by Leigh's artistry and dedication. Despite Olivier's eventual presence in Hollywood to appear in the film Carrie, an ill-fated production that involved David O. Selznick's second wife, Jennifer Jones, he had zero influence on the production of Streetcar, which finished filming in September 1950. After both actors finished in California, they decided to return to Britain in a cargo ship. A lengthy journey through the Panama Canal possibly meant to rejuvenate their now precarious relationship. It didn't work, Olivier later claiming that his hostility towards his wife and isolation at sea induced suicidal thoughts. Vivien must have had a similar perspective. As soon as she got home, she went on a Mediterranean yachting vacation on Alexander Korda's yacht without Olivier. More conscious of their finances, Olivier determined that despite their Hollywood paydays, they were still broke as a result of living lavishly. He hit upon the idea of playing both Shaw's Caesar and Cleopatra and Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra back-to-back, with Vivien playing Cleopatra in both plays, having to play a 16-year-old and a woman in her 30s and make the switch convincing. These productions were successful enough to eventually tour for Britain and then play for over 130 performances at New York's Shubert Theater. In fact, Vivien's appearances in early March of Antony and Cleopatra precluded her from personally receiving her second Academy Award for her portrayal of Blanche in A Streetcar Named Desire. Although her performance did not reflect her mental trauma, Olivier worried that her conditions seemed to be worsening, and their relationship continued to suffer as a result. In New York, depression overtook Vivien Leigh to the extent that she spent much of her day in bed, so distraught that for the first time she agreed to see a psychiatrist, who quickly diagnosed her condition as manic depression. Unfortunately, she returned to Britain and did not seek further treatment, and with no medication even in existence to treat her condition, a breakdown crisis was inevitable. Cast in the film Elephant Walk, which was to be shot in Ceylon, and initially also was supposed to star Laurence Olivier, Vivien eventually would have to go it alone when her husband was cast in The Beggar's Opera instead. This proved a recipe for disaster, as the cast of Elephant Walk also included Peter Finch, an up-and-coming star who the Oliviers had met in Australia, Vivien engaging in a sporadic sexual relationship with Finch when the actor emigrated to England in 1948. She immediately resumed this behavior in Ceylon and also engaged in such antics as knocking on co-star Dana Andrews' dressing room in the nude. Called by the producer, who begged him to intercede, Olivier came to Ceylon as quickly as possible. But other than his wife informing him that she was having an affair with Finch, there was nothing he could really do, and in a matter of days, he returned to Britain. Leigh's condition deteriorated completely. She began to hallucinate and seemed to confuse Finch with her husband, repeatedly loudly and publicly calling him Larry. Flown to Los Angeles for additional filming on a soundstage, she began screaming in midair that the plane's wing was on fire and needed to be physically restrained and sedated. Paramount attempted to continue filming Elephant Walk, but within days, Leigh suffered a complete nervous breakdown, with friends like David Niven and Stuart Granger called to the house at all hours of the night to try and calm her down. Instead, she would physically attack anyone who came near, frequently while completely naked. Olivier was quickly summoned, and the studio made the decision to stop filming and let him take her back to Britain. Upon landing, despite publicity photos that indicated nothing was amiss, she was conveyed to Netherne Hospital, an expensive psychiatric facility. Elephant Walk eventually resumed, with Elizabeth Taylor taking Vivien's place. Upon admission, Vivien Leigh was kept heavily sedated for days and continuously received the relatively new treatment of electroshock therapy. After 3.5 months of confinement, she was discharged, seemingly well enough to attend the June 2, 1953 coronation of Elizabeth II. Olivier's career powered on with the filming of Richard III, with a star-studded cast that included Sir Cedric Hardwicke, Sir John Gielgud, and Sir Ralph Richardson. Although well-received in both Britain and the U.S., the film was considered at the time the weakest of these three Shakespeare-filmed epics. A re-release in 1966 and eventual appreciation transformed it into consideration among Olivier's finest works. Once again, Vivien Leigh was denied a role in the film in favor of a much younger Claire Bloom, a development that did little for her fragile psyche. It would be 1955 before she appeared on screen again in the disappointing The Deep Blue Sea, probably miscast as a plain housewife who leaves her marriage only to be eventually dumped herself. Vivien was in her early 40s, but still was one of the most famous and glamorous female movie stars in the world, and anything but plain box office for the film was disappointing. In 1956, it was back to the stage. Leigh slated to appear in the Noel Coward comedy South Sea Bubble. Working closely with the playwright on revisions, Leigh's performance in the play itself was initially a great success, Coward's first in a decade, but then a completely unexpected development ended Leigh's participation when she discovered that she was pregnant at age 42. Thrilled with the situation because she believed it might salvage her moribund marriage, Leigh immediately left the production despite a livid Noel Coward, who thought her age and disposition to alcohol, late nights, and lifestyle did not bode well for her pregnancy. His anger permanently damaged his relationship with both Oliviers, especially when a month later, on August 13th, Leigh miscarried, a development that again set off a mental health spiral. Almost on cue, another development added to the chaos of the Oliviers' relationship. Marilyn Monroe's production company had purchased the rights to the Terence Rattigan play The Sleeping Prince and intended to star Monroe in a film entitled The Prince and the Showgirl. Olivier and Vivien Leigh had starred in a 1953 version of the play, and now Olivier was the logical choice to play the male lead in the film, which recounts a romance between a member of European royalty and an actress. Warned by other directors about Monroe's unpredictable behavior and immaturity, Olivier was originally deeply attracted to her breathy vulnerability and remarkable sensuality. Their initial news conference, a media sensation thronged with press and fans. But Monroe was accompanied by her husband Arthur Miller, and Olivier, when socializing with the couple, and no doubt intrigued by the eminent playwright, began to pay more attention to him. Things deteriorated during filming, with Olivier directing a Monroe who couldn't remember lines, blew take after take, and seemed increasingly disinterested in his direction. Her passive aggression increased to the point of leaving the set on some pretext, and then remaining in her trailer, refusing to emerge for hours, despite Olivier resorting to pounding on her dressing room door, or Marilyn showing up late to even begin filming, the type of behavior bound to exasperate Olivier, a consummate professional actor and perfectionist. Although it is alleged that she suffered her own miscarriage during filming, which might explain her listless performance, she became so unresponsive and eventually hostile to Olivier that he considered shutting the picture down entirely. Told insurers wouldn't prevent a massive loss, he soldiered on. When the film was completed, Monroe returned to the U.S. without even saying goodbye to any members of the cast or crew. Most were thrilled to merely just be rid of her. Upon release, the film was a predictable box office bomb. After such a desultory experience, and with his marriage now a hollowed-out relationship meant strictly for public consumption, it was not surprising that Olivier might seek a new and different artistic direction. Like many theater professionals, he had been stunned by John Osborne's Look Back in Anger, the first realist play to make a splash in British theater. This play not only depicted the dreary, financially challenged relationship of a married couple, it also featured the main male character's political and social tirades against a decaying and classist society, which offers him no real opportunity. As a symbol of accomplished British society, Olivier might seem the last person who would respond to such a broadside to the conventional status quo. But after seeing the play for a second time, he approached Osborne and asked if he might be interested in writing something specifically tailored for Olivier. Unbeknownst to the actor, Osborne was already working on a new play about a typical British vaudevillian, an individual whose style of performance was quite popular in the 30s and 40s, but was now barely keeping his and his variety show's head above water. Set in a typical British seaside resort town, the play also returned to the theme of the deteriorating quality of life in post-war late 50s Britain. Olivier's character, Archie Rice, is both a show business hack and an unethical manipulative adulterer who will do anything to keep what is left of his career alive. For Olivier, having just turned 50, the part was an interesting choice, leaving the audience to wonder how closely the accomplished actor identified with this persona. Although he toyed with the producer over the idea of casting Vivien Leigh, she was never seriously considered. A major part in the play was filled by Dorothy Tootin, at that point his longtime mistress. A critical success and commercial success in both London and New York, Olivier engineered a successful transition from traditional theater to cutting-edge drama, while Vivien Leigh's career continued to stagnate. In her early 40s, in an industry where the great female stars of the past were disappearing, and female youth was everything, a harsh career and even personal life reality was sinking in. By 1957, she was publicly seen vacationing in Italy with her daughter and ex-husband. Olivier moved out of their London apartment and became involved with the actress Joan Plowright, a 27-year-old hired to replace Dorothy Tootin. Tootin, after observing all of the drama in the Olivier marriage, including Vivien's vow that she would kill herself if Larry left her for Tootin, and her family's hostility to Olivier, decided to break off their lengthy relationship. Olivier proceeded to fall in love with Plowright. This time he was wise enough to ignore Vivien's request to meet her. In 1958, he explained to Vivien that he wanted a legal separation. Although it had been a long time coming, it was a shock to Vivien. During this time period, Olivier became enmeshed in the production chaos that bedeviled the film Spartacus. Within weeks of the start of production, the director and main female character played by Sabina Bethman were hastily replaced. The new director, 30-year-old Stanley Kubrick, clashed endlessly with the producer Kirk Douglas and Universal Studio management. The script, secretly written by a still blacklisted Dalton Trumbo, was constantly rewritten, adding more confusion, as well as filming, which took place in both Hollywood and Spain. Although Kubrick disavowed the finished film, it was the top-grossing movie of 1960 and remains one of Olivier's most memorable film roles. While on set, he wrote specifically to Vivien Leigh to request that they publicly acknowledge their separation and that when he returned they would live separately. She refused, and Olivier secretly moved in with Plowright, a repeat of Olivier's behavior upon leaving his first marriage. The inexorable process continued, the Olivier selling Notley, another symbolic step. Finally, the public was made aware of the situation when Vivien Leigh issued a press release on May 21, 1960, stating that Sir Laurence has asked for a divorce to marry Joan Plowright and that Lady Olivier would grant his request. While the industry had known of the Olivier's marital difficulties for several years, to the British public especially, they were still immensely popular and considered one of the great romances of the 20th century. Joan Plowright was starring with Olivier in Ionescu's Rhinoceros, but great public derision forced her to temporarily give way to her understudy, and she even received death threats. The British tabloids were continuing to evolve into a frightfully nasty institution, pestering everyone involved and offering large sums to any servants or workers disposed to spilling any intimate dirt. As soon as their respective divorces came through, as Plowright had also left her husband, and wanting to avoid such scrutiny, on March 17, 1961, Olivier married Plowright in a secret ceremony in the tiny town of Wilton, Connecticut. By then, Leigh was involved with actor John Merivale. However, especially in Leigh's later years, he was as much of a caretaker as anything else. In 1961, she was cast in the film The Roman Spring of Mrs. Stone, co-starring with Warren Beatty in a film derived from a novel by Tennessee Williams. Leigh played an aging stage actress, Beatty a narcissistic gigolo, in one of his first roles. A critical and box office failure, the film today is rarely seen and remembered chiefly as Vivien Leigh's penultimate film. During this time period, her alcohol consumption ramped up severely as a result of her trauma over her divorce, which she never got over, despite the incredible antagonism that marked at least the last decade of her marriage. Her next dramatic project was the stage musical Tovarish, a light-hearted comedy performed in New York, beginning in March of 1963, a role which won her a Tony Award for Best Actress in a Musical. Initially successful, she eventually began to break down again. On-stage and off-stage episodes of violence finally forced her understudy to assume her part before Ava Gabor was permanently hired to replace her. Sedated, she was again flown back to Britain, and accompanied by Merivale, she took up residence in her new home, Tickeridge Mill, a rural cottage in a bucolic 115-acre setting. Initially, Olivier did occasionally visit and kept in touch with an occasional letter, but as he started another family with Plowright, who quickly gave birth to 3 children, this contact waned and then ceased altogether. 1964 found Leigh in Los Angeles, part of the ensemble cast working on Ship of Fools, a cinema version of the recent best-selling novel by Catherine Ann Porter. Leigh played an aging, recently divorced Southerner who exhibits traits of both Scarlett O'Hara and Blanche Dubois, in a portrayal that is even darker than the latter because she actually now greatly resembled the character and the plot. Other performances by Simone Signoret, Lee Marvin, Oscar Werner, Jose Ferrer, and Michael Dunn rounded out a powerful and, for Leigh, final film. By now, her co-stars shrugged off her frequent absences and occasional nasty outbursts, aware that she was a deeply troubled individual. Despite its understanding, the film industry now understood that hiring Vivien Leigh was no longer conceivable, her mental and physical ailments rendering her way too erratic. She began to cough painfully, but did nothing, attributing this condition to heavy smoking. She was diagnosed again in May of 1967 with a recurrence of tuberculosis. In denial, she only sporadically took the various drugs prescribed to cure her and continued smoking and drinking heavily. On July 8, 1967, when Jack Merivale returned from one of his own performances to the London flat they shared in Belgravia's Eaton Square, the same apartment Leigh lived in with Olivier, Merivale found her collapsed on the floor. Vivien Leigh was dead, aged 53. Laurence Olivier was summoned by Merivale, who was astute enough to leave him alone in Vivien's bedroom, the body now positioned on the bed. Later he wrote, "I was alone with the one with whom I had shared a life that resembled nothing so much as an express lift skying you upwards and throwing you downwards in insanely non-stop fashion. I stood and prayed for forgiveness for all of the evils that had sprung up between us." Olivier would live for another 22 years, his most artistically creative days behind him. Although he did appear in the critically acclaimed 1972 film Sleuth with Michael Caine, he focused more on his finances, appeared in highly paid roles in films like Marathon Man, The Boys from Brazil, and The Jazz Singer, not seeming to care about the quality of the film as long as the price was right. His health not particularly good, even at the time of Vivien Leigh's death, when he was already being treated for prostate cancer, further deteriorated with heart trouble and dermatomyositis, a long-term skin condition that combined inflammation and skin rash, pain to the touch, and extreme sensitivity to light. As he grew older and his health worsened, it affected his relationship with his third wife, and they began to spend time apart. Plowright working in London, Olivier residing mostly in the family's summer cottage in Ashurst, Sussex. He died there of renal failure on July 11, 1989. In truth, he had been ill with many ailments for many years. His cremated remains were subsequently buried in Westminster Abbey in 1991. Years earlier, in a press conference with Marlon Brando, just prior to the beginning of filming of A Streetcar Named Desire, Vivien Leigh was asked what she thought happened to Scarlett O'Hara. Her answer was only partially prescient as it related to her own life when she responded, "I think she probably became a better woman, but I don't think she ever stopped loving him." Thank you for listening to part 2 of this podcast about Laurence Olivier and Vivien Leigh. Information for this podcast came from the books Truly Madly by Stephen Galloway, Olivier by Terry Coleman, and Vivien Leigh by Hugo Vickers. There are also additional photographs, bibliographical and musical information at someveryfamouspeople.com. If you have enjoyed this presentation, please like us at our Facebook page, Some Very Famous People, and follow us on Twitter at Philip D. Gibbons. Subscribe to my YouTube page at Noblesse Oblige, and please tell a friend about bite-sized biographies.